Welcome into The Rundown, a daily podcast where we at CBN News bring you inside information about the stories we're working on. Today is Friday, April 16th, and I'm Caitlyn Burke. The Biden administration is imposing sweeping sanctions on Russia and expelling 10 Russian diplomats. The moves are meant to punish Russia for interfering in U.S. elections and hacking into federal agencies. Meanwhile, Moscow is making moves of its own. More than 80,000 Russian troops are now amassed along Ukraine's eastern border. CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas was in the region just last year. He says this could be saber-rattling designed to test the West, or the precursor to a major offensive. He joins me now. George, what is the history between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, you have to go back to right before right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, back in 1989, 1990. Ukraine was part of one of the provinces that made up the USSR, the former USSR. And so when communism fell, all these breakaway republics became independent nations, and Ukraine was one of them. Back in 2005, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, said that the collapse of the USSR in 1990-1991 was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has always had this ambition, this dream of reconstituting these various breakaway republics, from Slovenia to Lithuania to Macedonia to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, you name it, all of these former Soviet, Georgia among them, to reconstitute it and to regain the glory days, so to speak, of the Soviet Empire. And so in the context of this, you saw back in 2014, when the Russians, they were called back then little green men, who decided to march into Crimea, and yours truly was in Sevastopol, Crimea, the day that the little green men, ostensibly the Russians, then they marched into the Crimean Peninsula and took over the peninsula. We just managed to get out of the city pretty much in the nick of time. Took the last flight out before the Russians invaded the Crimean Peninsula. And subsequently, a few months later, another batch of little green men decided to march across the eastern Ukrainian border and took up positions, took a chunk of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, what's called the Donbass region, Luhansk, Donetsk, critical cities on the east part of the country. And since then, there's been this sort of low-grade war between the Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army. We've seen sort of a lull, call it a frozen war, since last July. Things were somewhat peaceful, so to speak, but things really ratcheted up this year. I think 30 plus Ukrainian soldiers have died in various skirmishes since January. And so this is the context. And now you have we don't know exactly, but according to Ukraine, close to about 80,000 Russian soldiers who have amassed on the border in the last few weeks. One British tabloid newspaper claimed they had evidence that the Russians had deployed close to about 1,300 tanks, some 3,600 drones. There are reports of surface-to-surface missiles and other heavy military weapons, armored personnel carriers, tanks, and so forth. And in fact, one report says there are maybe over 100,000 troops on the border right now. And so all of this happening, that in the last 24, 48 hours, the United States slapped Russia with a set of broad sanctions against 10 top Russian officials and other companies that were allegedly involved in cyber attacks on U.S. companies, on the U.S. government, alleged interference in the presidential elections. And so all this coming in the middle of thousands of Russian troops amassing on the border, U.S. levying sanctions on Russia. And just a few weeks ago, you remember President Biden called Vladimir Putin a killer. And so all of this happening on another front in another part of the world that obviously has not just Washington, but European capitals very concerned.
So if you had to guess, what would you say that Putin's strategy is here?
I think you have two options. I think the optimistic view, one can say, is that this is, what the experts would say, saber-rattling, right? They're trying to pressure the government in Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine, put some pressure on them to try and bring some kind of a lasting peace to the eastern Ukraine. What the Russians would like is that these two provinces, the Donbas region, Luhansk, Donetsk, would basically become Russian territory. Would officially become Russian territory. Of course, like Ukrainians are not going to let that happen. But so the optimistic view is that this is Moscow putting pressure on Kyiv and trying to squeeze more out of any potential peace talks, negotiations, and then also put some pressure on the new 3-month-old Biden-Kamala Harris administration, because they clearly have not had a chance to, maybe as of this moment, not had a chance to come up with some kind of a Ukraine-Russia foreign policy. And again, this is trying to see what the Biden mantle is made of. Can they stand the test or the pressure of Moscow? The pessimistic view is that Russia is preparing for an all-out offensive. And now, granted, the movement of troops, the movement of tanks has been very visible. So the idea of a surprise attack, you've obviously lost that. But it costs a lot of money to move that much, that amount of military hardware, personnel. That's a lot of money. And so, I think in between these two, there is the truth, I guess. But everybody's keeping a very, very close eye. Keep in mind, the U.S. made an agreement with Ukraine following the fall of communism in 1991 that if Ukraine were to give up its stockpile of nuclear weapons, that in exchange, the United States and Europe would come to the aid of Ukraine if it were ever invaded, taken over by any other country. That was the agreement. Now, Ukraine has for a long time wanted to join the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, has wanted to be part of NATO. Obviously, that's something the Russians do not want, because that would mean a NATO member right on Russia's doorstep. And so Russia has been pushing back against this idea. It feels like countries around its border are kind of edging in, getting closer and closer, creeping closer, and they're concerned. And so they don't want a major NATO alliance country like Ukraine, if they were to join NATO, right on its border. So you have these various regional geopolitical events that are unfolding at the same time, while the United States tries to. I was going to say the point about Ukraine was that when Russia invaded Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014, well, guess what? The United States didn't do anything. Neither did our European allies. So this gives no comfort to Ukraine and other former Soviet Union republics, whether it be Lithuania, Latvia, Macedonia, you name it, that the United States or our European partners will step up to the plate and protect them. So that's a big concern. And we didn't do anything. Now, granted, we hit them with some severe sanctions, the Russian government, that, experts say has hurt the government, has hurt the economy, because of its activities in the East. But the reality is that we did not get into a battle with the Russians to push them out of Ukraine. And we did nothing to stop them from taking over the Crimean Peninsula, a very, very strategic plot of real estate that sits right on the Black Sea, a major waterway, sort of a crisscross center of bringing together the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. And we did nothing.
What message would you say President Biden's actions have sent to Russia thus far?
Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken this week has talked about, that there would be consequences for any continued Russian aggression. But the government, obviously, the White House, stopped short of saying exactly what those consequences would be, and neither did they say categorically whether they would intervene and stop any potential invasion of Ukraine. So the president did speak with Vladimir Putin this week, brought up the matter about Ukraine. In fact, at his press conference yesterday, when he was announcing the sanctions on Russia, said to Vladimir Putin about Ukraine that, listen, you need to pull your forces back, to de-escalate the situation, that when it is in America's national interests, that the U.S. and Russia would like to seek a closer relationship, to be a stabilizing partnership in the region, and that when it threatens our national security and our interests in Europe, that the United States will stand up to Russia. Now, we've hit them with some crippling sanctions. They will probably do the same. We've expelled a bunch of Russian officials. They're probably going to do the same, a tit-for-tat response. You can expect that this weekend into next week. This is part of the game that the governments play, right, back and forth. But the reality is that we both need each other in various issues, matters of geopolitical crises around the world. And the Russians have alliances that we don't particularly care for. For example, Russia's strong relationship with China, strong relationship with Iran, which are big threats to the United States. So far, the Biden administration's response has been, there are going to be consequences. Well, what does that mean? They said the same thing in 2014. And, so the Russians know what the U.S. response has been in the past. And you're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, right? And they know getting into a fighting war with the United States would be catastrophic, to say it, mildly. So whether the Russians want to make that calculus or even to test the U.S., I think we're going to see.
Well, as the politicians go back and forth, I'm sure the people on the front lines in Ukraine are terrified as they see this huge amount of Russian troops just across the border. Are you hearing anything from the front lines?
Yeah, I was there last year in a city called Opernaya, which is right a stone's throw away from the Russian sort of demarcation line where the Russian-backed separatists had taken over. And, it's been very difficult for those who live in this part of Ukraine. They're constantly under sniper fire, constantly they don't have water, don't have resources, food is in short supply. Now, granted, since then, a lot of people on the Ukrainian side have moved to maybe the capital city, to other parts of Ukraine to be with family members, but their homes are in the eastern part. Now, when we went to Opernaya last year, there were still dozens of families that had no running water, no electricity, and practically depended on the handout of various NGOs, church groups, evangelical organizations that work on the front line. That's how they survived. And they still survive today like that. I spoke to one of my close contacts who works in the eastern part of the country, in some of the rebel-held territories. They have multiple bread-making factories and other initiatives to provide bread, to provide jobs. resources for those living on the front line. And it's difficult. And now they see this again. This is nothing new. They've experienced this since 2014, and they are very much on edge, not sure what's going to happen. But the groups that are working there are trying to, bring hope, bring peace, help people understand where their future lies, and it's in Jesus Christ. And there's also outreach among the Russian-backed separatists on the other side. It's a very dangerous outreach, but again, Christians who live there, who are working there, are there in the middle of the conflict. Groups like Mission Eurasia and others that are doing great work on the front line. And so we continue to keep them in our prayers. But, this is, again, I think part of, you got to put it in the context of when the new administration takes the helm of our country and a new occupant comes into the White House, countries around the world will want to test, right? We see this happening in Myanmar with the takeover, the military junta taking over in a coup in February. That country is in a mess right now. A tragic situation unfolding in Myanmar. We see what's happening right now in Ukraine. We see the Iran crisis. I think you're going to expect more of this in different parts of the world. Afghanistan is a big one. Now the U.S. just announced that they're going to withdraw all of our troops by 9/11. That's a powder keg right there. After 20 plus years, what have we done? What have we achieved in Afghanistan? All that to say, these are the next few months, weeks and months ahead. I think we're going to see more and more of this that would continue to test this new administration.
He's got tests coming in from a lot of different fronts internationally, it seems like. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, guys, you can find our coverage on this. You can find a story that George did on our website, cbnnews.com. So be sure to check that out. George, thanks so much for coming on.
You're most welcome anytime.
CBN News provides a faith-based perspective on the most important stories of the day. But it takes time, hard work, and resources. Will you help us continue to be a voice for truth in the media? Visit cbnnews.com/give now. And thanks for listening. Some other headlines we're following today. A 19-year-old is responsible for killing 8 people and wounding several more at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis. The deceased gunman, Brandon Scott, has been identified as an ex-employee. The White House says the violence must end and is calling for Congress to act. And former Vice President Mike Pence has undergone surgery to have a pacemaker implanted. His office says that Wednesday's procedure went well and that Pence is expected to completely recover and return to normal activity in the coming days. The 61-year-old Pence had experienced symptoms associated with a slow heart over the past 2 weeks. That's all for now, but if you're enjoying the CBN News Daily Rundown, be sure to check out the CBN News app. As certain voices are censored and free speech platforms are shut down, downloading it will ensure you keep receiving news from a Christian perspective. I'll meet you back here Monday with more of the top stories and behind-the-scenes insight into how we're covering them.